Okay.
Okay, I'll get started. Welcome, everyone. This is exciting to have all of you here. Affordable housing is a huge concern, and it's like I describe it like as a whack-a-mole, that from an outsider looking at it, there are so many different moving parts, and you move one, and you've got something else to think about. And how do you deal with everything? And you're talking about people's lives, so it's really important. So Adam Gross and Rebecca Janowitz are going to talk and give us their view and with what we can do about it. Let me introduce Rebecca. She's a special assistant for legal affairs at Cook County Justice Advisory Council. She works on criminal justice policy and grant programs for Cook County. As part of this work, she helps coordinate housing for people released from jail and prison. Many of these individuals are on electronic monitoring. Prior to this assignment, she worked on housing issues in the Quad Communities areas of Chicago's South Side. Some of you might remember Adam Gross from this August when he was our speaker about police accountability, which is his current responsibility at BPI, Business and Professional People for the Public Interest.
Yeah, that's
before shifting to the work on police accountability and justice reform, he spent 10 years as director of BPI's affordable housing program. Before banks and other financial institutions destroyed the world economy, he worked to expand housing opportunities for low and moderate income people by developing, advocating for, and helping to implement state and local policies and programs to create and preserve affordable housing, ensure that it's distributed equitably throughout the Chicago region. Then when the housing market collapsed, he worked to create and implement systemic responses to the foreclosure and vacant property crises, including state and local laws and policies to help owners facing foreclosure. I think I'm going to let you start. Just mention, if you have questions, put them in the chat box. And well, if we don't answer all the questions, this is what we usually do. If we don't answer all the questions tonight, we'll have our speakers answer them and get them to you in a follow-up. So welcome, Adam and Rebecca.
okay. Well, I'm going to launch in and talk for a little bit and then turn things over to Adam. I was warned not to begin by trying to describe or define affordable housing, because if you think about it, all housing is affordable to someone. A few years ago, Queen Elizabeth took a look at Buckingham Palace and the bills and opened a gift shop. It had been an affordable palace. It was becoming a less affordable palace. So I still think, though, it's worth talking a little bit about the relationship between subsidized housing, affordable housing, and market rate housing. And I first learned about those three categories many years ago when I worked on the South Side, and we were taking down I was an aldermanic assistant to Tony Preckwinkle. Can you talk to Tony? I can't talk to him. Tony's trying to get into the meeting to hear it, and she keeps calling me to ask for advice. But to get back to the presentation. Okay, you can't be so close to the screen, honey. So we were taking down a lot of public housing. We were famous for blowing up part of the public housing, but we built three kinds of housing. And that's when I really learned about how you need different kinds of housing and how they support each other. We built 1/3 subsidized housing, and that was in the form of units of housing that were built and were leased to the Chicago Housing Authority and became part of the pool of available public housing or subsidized housing. Then we built affordable housing and we built market rate housing. And I really learned the most about the dynamic interrelationship between these types of housing when we built some market rate housing. There was a great deal of excitement about the new housing in the ward. And this was in the 4th ward. It was in the 4 communities of North Kenwood, Oakland, Douglas, and Grand Boulevard. And this was a neighborhood which had been saturated with high-rise public housing, and there had not been a market rate house built in the neighborhood since World War II. And one of the things I learned was that there was a pent-up demand actually for market rate housing. And there was a what they call parade of homes, where different developers came in and built houses. And so we had the first market rate housing being built there that had been built for a long time. But the most successful project in terms of focused community interest was a thing called the Cottage Grove Garden Apartments. And they were market rate. They were quite expensive. Housing for elderly people that included a clinic and in the building. And that was the housing that more people followed us around in the neighborhood and grabbed onto us and said, you got to move my name up on the waiting list. The receptionist and I started hiding from people who wanted to move into that housing because they were the most aggressive. And what they were older people who had lived in the neighborhood for years, who had houses, who had income, but they didn't want to have a yard anymore. They didn't want to have the basement anymore. They wanted to live in a high rise. And this high rise was particularly attractive because it had a medical clinic in it, specially set up to serve the need of seniors. So as one woman said to me, if I can get a unit in that building, I can make my husband have his blood pressure checked as he's trying to make it down to the car. I can stop him in the lobby and get his blood pressure checked. And she said to me, and it's the only way it's ever going to happen. So there was incredible dynamism around these units. And I saw this transformative power of having the housing that met the neighborhood needs. So I'll talk a little bit now about the supply of affordable housing. There are two things you can do. You can, as a community and particularly as a government, you can preserve existing housing and you can construct more affordable housing. And both of those things are really important. And particularly, I find the debates about this in Chicago tend to leave out the issue of preserving the existing housing. Government policies and practices can either encourage affordable housing or hinder it. And the city of Chicago for years has hurt affordable housing for decades by using regulations and code enforcements to promote demolition instead of preservation, and by using regulations, and that's what they did for the years that I worked there. Every Wednesday when I worked in the ward office, I would go down to the 11th floor of the Daily Center to answer the demo call. And that would be the call where they would be trying to tear down buildings in the ward. And we would step up and we would try to prevent it. And I have to say that the judges were willing to listen to arguments for preservation. They would understand. And the pressure that was brought to bear on the building owners was to bring them into compliance. And they would yell, plans and permit 30 days. I always had an enormously wonderful time on the 11th floor. It was so interesting to meet the people who are trying to save the buildings, the people who are trying to tear them down, the buildings. It was great fun. It was a very exciting place. And it was actually a place where the community voice could be heard. On one occasion, I was trying to save a bank building at the corner of 47th Street. It wasn't landmarked, but it was considered a contributing structure. And the sleaze who had bought it and wanted to tear it down and build a strip mall said to the judge, I resent the fact that Alderman Preckwinkle keeps sending that toady in every week to try and stop me from tearing down that building. And I yelled out, Your Honor, I object on the record. I am a flunky, not a toady, F-L-U-N-K-Y, flunky. And I want the record to reflect that. Well, the guy who was taking the notes on the little court, he started laughing. He knocked his machine over in chaos in the courtroom. Judge Patty, who was running the place, said to the guy, "You cannot talk to Miss Janowitz like that in this courtroom." But what happened was that the city ended the process of those kinds of hearings, and they moved everything into an administrative process where the goal was not to save the buildings or to enforce that they were kept in a proper order and that they were repaired, but the goal was to collect fines, to use this as an alternative source of revenue. And they're much more interesting in levying the fines, and have been for years now, than on trying to get the buildings repaired. And in general, I'm opposed to having more judges, and I'm opposed to specialty courtrooms, but I'll tell you, I wouldn't mind bringing back some of the housing courts to let the neighborhood express the desire to have buildings saved and to have them taken proper care of. The other practices, I got to stop talking soon because it's going to be Adam's chance to talk, but other practices that discourage affordable housing are unreasonable building code requirements. And some of them reflect the economic interest of the trades unions and other groups. It's not that people aren't entitled to have, we need to have a building code, but we have to make sure that it doesn't wind up for being a vehicle for making housing more expensive than it needs to be in order to be safe. We also have ridiculous zoning requirements and really unhelpful parking requirements. We don't need to require as much parking. And remember, requiring additional parking immediately sends the cost of housing up. The alternative to this is to look at the transportation and improve the transportation. And you've got to remember that whenever the government acts to improve public transportation, you're expanding the affordable housing available to any particular group of people. Depends on where they live. If they have access to decent public transportation, they can get to work, which means they can work more places, they can live farther from work, it increases the pool of housing available to particular people. Going back to Mayor Daley too, we had an obsession in the city that somehow vacant buildings, instead of being saved and renovated, should be torn down because they would attract crime. Actually, it's people that attack crime, not vacant buildings. And so they were always arguing against density. And what we've seen now is that communities have become less dense and they have become less safe. When I first went to work for the county, which was now about 12 years ago, I was appalled to find out how unsafe some of the South suburban communities were. The crime rate in Ford Heights, for example, was 4 times that of the most dangerous city of Chicago police district. But really, what underlined the tragedy was that there were no people left. Ford Heights had been a community of 40,000. It was now a community of 8,000 or 9,000, depending on how you counted it. And these terribly small, very sparsely occupied communities became very, very unsafe. And it absolutely chills me because recently in the city, we're seeing rates of violence in some of the city neighborhoods that are just so appallingly high in neighborhoods with so few people in them. And we have to really think about what the cost we're paying for the lack of safe and affordable housing in much of the city. I believe that it is a huge factor in the Black exodus from Chicago. Black families have found safe and affordable housing, Black families from Chicago, but they found it in Atlanta, which has been very good for the Senate, but has not been good for Chicago. And we have to think about that, what the cost is to our city of failing to provide that housing. Just to give you a little bit about, I was going to talk about the land bank, and then it turned out Adam knows more about the land bank than I do, but the land bank is a feature of county government whereby abandoned buildings are taken into the land bank and then they can be given to not-for-profits. So one of my favorite sources of affordable housing is the Aman organization, which is the Inner City Muslim Action Network. If you're Jewish, you can kind of relate to it because it was a group of medical providers who came together because of their religion, and they started running a free clinic. And then they found out that the people they were providing free medical care to had no place to live. So they get buildings from the land bank, they get guys released from prison, they teach them how to fix the buildings, and then they sell the buildings as affordable housing. Some they keep and rent, but others they sell. And they said it was the most interesting thing because they were assumed that the neighborhood would be very nervous about bringing in guys from prison to live there. But once they started fixing up some of the sleazier looking buildings in the neighborhood, they got enormous local approval. And they sort of wrapped that approval that they got for the work that these ex-offenders were doing around the ex-offenders and made them much more acceptable in the community. So I think Iman is a shining example of how you can turn these things that many people fear and regard as a real problem, these deteriorating buildings, but you can turn them around and you can have affordable housing and you can provide an income source for ex-offenders. So I think that's a wonderful program. We also have, I'll just mention, because nobody knows about it, we have a housing authority in Cook County. Everyone thinks all the public housing is owned by the Chicago Housing Authority, who own all the public housing in Chicago, but we have our own, the Cook County Housing Authority, which builds and maintains public housing in the part of Cook County that surrounds Chicago. The head of it is Rich Minacchio, who was once, I think, the most innovative head of housing for the city of Chicago. And we have what I think is a very admirable program for family reunification, whereby ex-offenders can move back and rejoin their families unless renting to them would cause the building to lose its federal subsidy. So we have a very expansive program there for family reunification in those units of subsidized housing. So I'm trying to think something else. Oh, this is a very, very unexpected thing to be able to say this evening, and then I'll turn it over to Adam. We have to thank President Trump, apparently. Not words that bubble out of my mouth all the time, but apparently most recently, the federal rates for affordable housing bonds have been raised to 4%, which means that more private money, this was in the very last budget thing that Trump's people did. So this was a way that the government is acting to increase private investment in affordable housing. So, and it came from at an unexpected moment. So that's a very good thing. And then I work a great deal right now on housing for people released from jail and prison. I want to turn it over to Adam, but if people are interested in that, I can talk about it a bit later. So Adam, where is Adam?
I'm now unmuted. Can you hear me?
You're unmuted, and I'm muting.
Rebecca is never muted. Hello, thank you for inviting me back despite my last performance. I thought Beth was very clever in advertising just Rebecca so that anyone who participated in the Police Accountability Forum wouldn't be kept away. And for those of you who heard me talk about police accountability, if you want to use this opportunity to go get a bite to eat or listen to a podcast or something and join back in when Rebecca comes back, I'll totally understand. I'm going to start by I'd like to quickly pick up on two things that Rebecca touched on for a moment, just to say that affordable housing is a fantastically complicated issue, in part because we try to use affordable housing to solve problems that aren't necessarily at their root housing related, and that's really challenging. So Rebecca talked, for example, about population loss, and she used Fort Heights as an example. City of Chicago has had problems in some communities, not totally unlike Ford Heights. Since 1950, the population of the city of Chicago has declined by about 900,000 people. So Chicago's lost almost a quarter of its population in the last 70 years. And that population loss has been concentrated in a relatively small number of communities. And when you have that kind of population loss, it's really hard to attract to a community the kinds of things that make people want to live in a community, or to create the kind of safety that you want in a community. And it's hard to solve that problem, the loss of population, through housing. There are ways that you can use housing as a tool, but once you've lost that kind of population, it's hard to get it back. It's hard to attract new homeowners, new renters, new businesses, new investors into those communities once people have gone. Second thing that is a much bigger issue than housing, but winds up having creating all kinds of challenges in the world of housing, is that the labor market in the United States has changed a huge amount, especially in the last 50 years. It used to be that without a college education, even without a high school education, you could get a decent paying job that would afford you the opportunity to live in decent housing, certainly to rent, sometimes even to own. Those kinds of jobs mostly don't exist now. There are many fewer of them than there were before. So if you don't have a decent education, it is very hard to make enough to live in decent housing. And it's hard to solve that problem just by making housing more affordable to you. We were able to thrive as a city for a long time because people's incomes were rising. They were rising across the spectrum, so more and more people could afford housing. Now the labor market has changed so much that the population of lower income people is growing, and it's really hard to solve those problems just by providing housing, because as Rebecca noted, producing affordable housing is really expensive. So Rebecca talked broadly about the cost of housing, the challenges of getting people into housing that they can afford. And I want to talk about one slice of the affordable housing challenge, which is not just about the availability of affordable housing, but about the location of affordable housing, about where housing is located, because where housing is located makes a huge difference. And when we think about increasing affordable housing or increasing access to affordable housing, we need to think about where that housing is located. So we need to do more to provide opportunities in communities that don't currently have a lot of affordable housing. And we also need to think about strengthening communities where there's already a decent supply of affordable housing, but those communities are struggling for different reasons. So why does housing location matter? Why is this so important? So where you live determines the quality of education you're going to get, whether you have good, easy access to a job that pays a living wage, what kind of access you have to opportunities to buy things like decent grocery stores where you can get fresh food, healthy food. Where you live determines the likelihood that you'll develop certain illnesses. And if you get sick, whether you'll have access to quality health care. It determines the likelihood that you'll be a victim of a violent crime. And cumulatively, all of these things have an enormous impact on our lives. So if you look at a person who lives in Lakeview and compare a person who lives in Lakeview to a person who lives in West Garfield Park, the average life expectancy in Lakeview is 83 years. The average life expectancy in West Garfield Park is 69 years. So if you live in Lakeview, a small number of miles away from West Garfield Park, you're likely to live 14 years longer. If we were to look across Cook County and compare life expectancy in different census tracts, the biggest gap in life expectancy from one census tract to another is 18 years. So there's this huge link between where you live and how long you live and your quality of life. Now, I'm not saying that living in one community rather than another causes you to live a longer or a shorter life. Like if a Lakeview resident moved to West Garfield Park, it's not going to right away shave 14 years off their life. But geography is tied to so many advantages and disadvantages that independently and cumulatively affect our health and well-being. So when we think about where people live, we don't just want to think about providing a roof over someone's head, but we want to think about whether their housing is providing them access to opportunity, to good schools, to good jobs, to safe places for their children to play, and all of that. And we can think concretely about how some of those things play out in real life. Like if we think about schools and geography and opportunity, we know right now the vast majority of failing schools with low student achievement are either in segregated city neighborhoods or they're in suburban areas with large Black or Latinx populations. And we know that lower income students who attend more integrated schools, particularly more economically integrated schools, are more likely to attend college and have higher incomes than their counterparts in segregated schools. And that makes the level of integration actually has a much bigger impact on student achievement than things like the amount of money we spend on schools. Now, I'm not making an argument for spending less on schools. I'm just saying that if we had better integrated schools, we could do a lot less, do a lot more, produce much better outcomes with the same amount of money. Another way to look at it is to think about concentrations of poverty and the relationship between concentrated poverty and race. So most poor white families don't live in neighborhoods where most people are poor. However, most poor Black families do live in neighborhoods where most people are poor. So how does that play out in school? When a poor white family sends a kid to a neighborhood school, the odds are that the majority of kids in that school are better off and are going to help help lift you up. Very different in predominantly Black neighborhoods where you're more likely to be surrounded by more lower income people. So schools in predominantly white neighborhoods are just going to provide more access to opportunities, connections, and resources. Related point, we're not building affordable housing in the same places where we're producing jobs. Most jobs today are being produced not in urban centers, but in suburban communities. And that's true for all kinds of jobs, not just white collar jobs. It includes manufacturing jobs, retailing jobs, wholesaling jobs. And job growth generally is much higher in the suburbs than in the city. only if you look at new jobs that are being produced, only about 10 or 15% of the new jobs are in cities. But there's very little affordable housing in or near the suburban communities where there are more job opportunities. So Rebecca talked about how there's been a significant movement of people from cities to suburbs. And that's true. And we've seen a lot of lower income people moving to suburbs as well. But we're seeing a lot of lower income people moving to suburbs where there are higher concentrations of poverty and the same kinds of challenges around access to resources, including quality jobs, quality schools, quality housing, as they have in cities. So there's not just sort of a simple urban suburban split where moving to the suburbs all of a sudden affords new opportunities. To the contrary, many people who are moving from cities to suburbs are moving to suburban communities where they are facing many of the same disadvantages that they had when living in the city. Segregation by income has been increasing over the last 30 years by a lot. So at the same time as suburbs have become more diverse across the board, segregation within suburbs has also increased. So, we haven't seen large numbers, particularly of lower income Black and Latinx families, benefiting tremendously from movement to the suburbs because there aren't opportunities to move into affordable housing in or near the suburbs that provide the best access to opportunity. If we look nationally, about 1/3 of Black families live in hyper-segregated, high-poverty neighborhoods. If you live in the Chicago region and you're poor and white, you're more likely to live in a middle class or a suburban setting than an area of concentrated poverty. If you are poor and Black in the Chicago region, there's a 7 in 8 chance that you live in a poor neighborhood. So city or suburbs, not a significant difference. So we really need to be thinking about where we're producing housing and where we're providing access to housing because the location is so important. How can we do those things? One way is we can make it easier for people to afford housing, either by giving them money or by giving them housing. We can also do things to make housing itself more affordable, working through the private market. Or we can work in communities that already have a lot of affordable housing and work to strengthen those communities so they aren't associated with the kinds of disadvantages I talked about earlier. I'll talk just a little bit about each of those categories. So first category, again, is making it easier for people to afford housing, either by giving them money to afford the housing or giving them housing. Rebecca talked mostly about producing affordable housing. Most people who get some sort of support for affordable housing get that in the form of a government-provided rent voucher, which they can use anywhere in the private market to rent housing. Lots of people take those rent vouchers and move to places where housing is most affordable or where they may feel the most comfortable. And moving into less, say, racially integrated suburban communities or city communities is a real challenge for people. There are ways in which that kind of move will make your life more difficult, even if it brings with it lots of advantages. There are a bunch of programs that have made very clear that helping lower income people move to higher income communities is a fantastically effective way to improve their life chances, and especially the life chances for their children. So using these rent vouchers is a really good way to provide better housing, and providing the support that people need to make those kinds of moves to more affluent communities can make a really big difference. We should also look at the places where we're producing subsidized housing, federally subsidized or state or locally subsidized housing. The vast majority of subsidized housing that we're creating in very poor communities. And we do that for a couple of reasons. One is it's cheaper to build in poor communities. The other reason is that people in more affluent communities generally fight hard against producing affordable housing. We need to be pushing back much harder in those fights, because producing more and more affordable housing in places where the schools aren't good, that have less access to jobs, that have lower quality healthcare, that have higher rates of violence, is compounding disadvantage with disadvantage. So tremendous benefits to producing more affordable housing with government subsidies in more affluent communities. There are also things that we can do working through the private market to create more affordable housing in market rate developments. One increasingly common tool is often referred to as inclusionary housing. So this is sort of in contrast to traditional zoning approaches. Rebecca talked a bit about how zoning has been used to make it harder to produce affordable housing. There are lots of ways that plays out. We have lots of places in the city where on lots of lots, all you can build are single family homes. We have suburban communities where you can only build single family homes on an acre of land or 2 acres of land, or in some suburban communities, 3 acres of land. Those kinds of zoning restrictions make it impossible to create affordable housing. So one thing we can be doing is changing those kinds of laws that make it difficult to produce affordable housing. We can also be using those same tools to incentivize the production of affordable housing. So City of Chicago, for example, has a program now, it's not as strong as it can or should be, which basically says if you're a housing developer and you get something of value from the city, like you buy some land, you're going to build an apartment building on the land. The zoning right now allows you to build, let's say, 12 units of housing. You want to build more housing on there. This inclusionary housing ordinance says will allow you to build more housing than you'd be allowed to build otherwise. Let's say you can go from building 12 units of housing to building 20 units of housing on the land that you own, but some of those additional units have to be affordable. And we can use those kinds of tools. So right now we have a system that makes developers not want to produce affordable housing because it's incredibly expensive for them to do it. We can use these kinds of tools in the building code and the zoning code so that developers make more money producing affordable housing than they would not producing affordable housing. So we can do that in a way that actually doesn't cost us anything in taxpayer dollars, but still results in the production of affordable housing, and the production of affordable housing in thriving communities that provide access to opportunity.
I think that's all really important. I just want to make sure that if people have any questions, because I see time is moving on, that we start answering any questions that folks have, just in case. Beth, are there any questions that have?
Yeah, I'm going through the.
I want to say, just in addition to these big programs, one of the things that's really troubled me is that when you see people trying to naturally add to the affordable housing, somebody wants to put a unit over their garage or wants to convert a 2-flat into a 3-flat. That is the kind of wealth acquisition that's really favored in a lot of Black and Latinx communities. And the city has been very, very rough on people wanting to do that kind of thing and made it more difficult for them than they need to be. And this isn't, so they're the big efforts and they're the smaller efforts if we just wouldn't get in the way of people who are trying to provide more affordable housing. I think that would be important. But do we have a question, Beth?
Pardon?
Do we have any questions?
Yeah, we have one from Kathy Carmody. Should there be uniform building codes for each city, or should each city or village have their own?
I really don't care whether they're uniform. I just want them to be smarter. I mean, if it makes people feel good to have their own building code, the United States of America includes some pretty large geographic variances. So I don't feel like making sure that the building code looks exactly the same in North Dakota as it does in Florida is really the issue. I think the issue is whether, and Adam, jump in here as you like, is whether the building code is there to protect the property owner or there to make sure that the people who build the building get the maximum pay for their work. There are aspects of the building code that really favor and restrict how repairs are made and things like that, which are more for job protection than for necessarily making the safest buildings. Have I put that tactfully enough, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, going to uniform building code is an easy way to solve a big problem. And there are a bunch of cities around the country that have shifted to uniform building codes. They're national building codes set by people who really want to make sure that people don't die in buildings. So they're not making people less safe. And when people shift to these nationally or internationally recognized building codes, it generally becomes cheaper to provide housing. We did some analysis together with a bunch of developers in the city of Chicago a couple of years ago, looking at the city of Chicago building code and comparing it to building codes in some neighboring jurisdictions. Places where people aren't dying in the buildings, people are perfectly safe, they're great building codes. We identified about 5 changes that you could make to the building code in the city of Chicago. And if you made those changes, you would reduce the cost of providing certain kinds of affordable housing by about 1/3. Now, from a developer's perspective, that's a giant-sized change. And all of those provisions that are there, getting in the way of producing more affordable housing, are, as Rebecca said, they're entirely to benefit building trades, which parenthetically are made up largely of people who don't live in the city. They're very white. They're pretty close-minded, but they're doing very well for themselves and not so much for the communities they serve.
Well, I would say that was true. They are less white than they used to be, Adam. We have had a lot, because construction is booming so much in Chicago. We've had fascinating conversations with the trades. They are actually much more willing to take people who are who have background than they used to be. And that's been great. One of my favorite conversations that occurred recently was one of the guys from one of the building trades was talking to a group about how they were willing to take guys with background. And one of the guys came back after the meeting and he said, look, he said, we're really desperate. He said, it's not just guys with records. We'll even take women. So you know, the trades are moving with the time. They'll take women. And I think that, I think those are all really important points. There are a couple other barriers I would point out just because I can't control myself here. This is into my justice end. We find a lot of guys could work in construction in Chicago. They have background, but they could get those jobs because construction is booming right now, but they can't get driver's licenses. And we don't have a public transportation system that's responsive enough, and they can't get the driver's licenses because of the usually traffic debt that's built up over the years and a whole bunch of other things. So, and we specifically are targeting now trying to get people their driver's licenses so they can get those construction jobs because the unions are desperate enough to hire anyone. But we should take the next question. I'm giving.
There's some other comments which I'll include in some follow-up. Kathy Carmody says it could also integrate school teaching staff more because many areas teachers can't afford to live in their communities. So that's an extension of what you've been saying. Beth Copeland asks, how difficult is it for someone to obtain an affordable housing voucher?
That's Adam. That's an Adam question. I've never done one with affordable housing voucher.
It's incredibly difficult. So one common misconception about affordable housing is that it's an entitlement. It isn't. It's not like Social Security or Medicare or food stamps, where if you meet some eligibility requirement, you get the help. So nationally, about 1 in 4 people who, just based on their income, are eligible for housing assistance get it. 75% of the people who are eligible for housing assistance don't get it. And they often spend many, many years on waiting lists. And in that time, they're often in housing that is substandard or that is much more expensive than they can afford, which means that they're paying something for housing which doesn't allow them to pay what they need for food or for medicine, or to save for education or to save for retirement. So the need just vastly outstrips the resources we've put into meeting the need.
Absolutely. And I think that it's interesting in the current discussion of what will make neighborhoods safer, there has not been as much conversation as I would have thought there would have been about transferring some money into supporting people to get into safer housing. Another question, Beth?
Oh, yeah, from Adam Lisberg. Many of the legal and structural changes that could address these issues generate enormous political opposition. How has this been done successfully in other jurisdictions?
I actually know very little about how it's been done successfully in other jurisdictions, but I have occasionally seen it done successfully in this one. It really is a question of political will and marshaling the support. I mean, this is something, these are issues that are available to be involved in on a very local level. In the neighborhood that I live in, which is the Gold Coast, we occasionally have the CHA owns some property and maybe they have a senior citizens building and they want to add units of family housing. And I have seen those fights come up. They are fights I would encourage people to watch for because they are really decided by how many people come in on each side. And usually the amount of change involved is very small. You can get involved in that kind of a discussion just by standing up for the addition of some family units to an existing senior building, for example. That was a big fight in my neighborhood last year. So we have, there is ample opportunity to win, not the huge fights, but to win some little fights that exist right now in Chicago. I would say that.
An ancillary question is how do people find out about these things? Because I live 2 blocks from you and I wasn't aware of any of those.
Oh, well,
Right.
that's on me. I sent out some emails on that one.
Okay.
So that's my fault. I think that I find if you give your name in ever to any of these affordable housing groups that exist in the city, you will hear from them for the rest of your life. And I will send you some people.
Okay. Because that's
my alderman, who's very right-wing on everything, is actually pro-affordable housing. So I've had the opportunity to occasionally agree with her in public, which is quite weird. But anyway,
Okay. Because
One thing that,
Adam, go ahead.
sorry, one thing that's the Better Adams question was about how to overcome opposition, how people have worked successfully in other jurisdictions to overcome opposition. One thing that's been done pretty effectively in some other jurisdictions is to try to work very deliberately to try to sort of take race out of the equation. So it's a terrible thing, but in many cities, a huge amount of the opposition to affordable housing is sort of a thin veneer for opposition to any kind of racial integration. And what some other cities have done very effectively is to just avoid that discussion altogether, to kind of hover over it, and focus on things like I think someone commented before about teachers. Teachers need affordable housing. Schools work better when teachers can live closer to the schools they serve. Nurses need affordable housing. Nurses' lives are better when they can live closer to work. So a lot of the push for affordable housing in other communities has shifted away from talk about race and focused instead on the needs of the workforce. And that's lowered some of the political opposition and has brought on board a lot of business support. There's a part of me that really struggles with that, because I understand that that a huge part of the impediment are these is this underlying racism, and there's the big part of me that wants to confront that directly, that says if we don't confront that directly, we're not going to succeed. But I can also say that in these other jurisdictions, avoiding that issue has made it easier to produce more affordable housing.
and we're on the cusp of a wonderful opportunity to make exactly that kind of argument, as long as we avoid confronting people's racism, which I find is very near and dear to their hearts, and it's best just to leave it alone. When we get to the other side of COVID, because we are going to get to the other side of COVID, we have the opportunity to thank all of the frontline workers who got us through this. The people, and not just the doctors and the nurses and the school teachers, but even the people who delivered all of the groceries. I mean, now is the time. People do feel gratitude, and this is a wonderful time to capture those feelings of gratitude and talk about how making housing more affordable would be a really nice way to say thank you. I see more questions popping up and I can't read them.
Yeah, I'll read them here. Phyllis Adams says, has anyone ever gone to George Soros or Oprah or the Gates Foundation to invest in a whole community, health clinics, better schools, businesses, to profit services and jobs?
Well, we did go to Atlantic Philanthropies back in the day, and we got the largest amount of money we'd ever gotten when we were redoing the public housing that we rebuilt. We also were doing a lot of work on schools, because we felt that schools, we hoped would be our, we had given up on racial integration, but we hoped for some economic integration. And we thought schools were the way, if we had really good schools, we would achieve some racial, economic integration, even if we couldn't achieve racial integration. And we did get a very large grant from the guy who sells liquor in airports, Philanthropies. I could, yeah, it was the duty-free money. It was called Atlantic Philanthropies. And it brought in, we put a lot of money into middle schools. The research showed that that was really the point at which you could make a great deal of difference in kids' lives. And if we brought in better medical care and a bunch of other things in the middle schools. So there have been some big projects like that. We were only partially successful. One of the schools that was part of the 5 that we focused on for that was closed by the Chicago Public Schools after we put the money into it. Without the coordination with we had coordination at the ward level. We did not have coordination at the city level, is what I would say. But there have been some projects like that.
Okay. Carol Levine says, can you talk about how developers can buy their way out of including affordable housing units in their buildings?
I don't know how to do that. I know a great deal about sin and iniquity, but that particular sin, I don't know the details of. I'm sorry.
I think what Carol's asking about is like the inclusionary housing program that I was talking about, which in some circumstances requires developers to produce affordable housing in market rate buildings that they're creating, also includes a provision that allows developers to pay money rather than create those units. And the problem is, so inclusionary housing can be a very effective tool, but the details matter. And what the city has done is created an ordinance that's actually more interested in generating that money than in producing affordable housing. So this is just a simple math problem. If we want developers to produce affordable housing in those units, don't make it so cheap to buy their way out of that obligation. And on the flip side, make it more advantageous to them if they produce the units rather than buy their way out of them. Allow them to build even more units than they would have been allowed to build otherwise, and then require that more of them be affordable. So developers are, they may be good people, they may be bad people. They're looking to make a profit. And we've set up a system that makes it easier for them in their minds to make the profit by buying their way out of the obligation than by producing the affordable units.
That's also the fact that the way the city is operated, which is to look at this as sources of income for the city. They look at things like code enforcement just as a means of bringing in money. Every not-for-profit that I know that maintains some housing has talked to me about how you can get fined $1,000 if your grass gets too high. Now, the city is not worried about how these neighborhoods look. They're looking for some alternative for property taxes to bring in the revenue. And they're balancing the budget off stuff they shouldn't be messing with. And unfortunately, it's a popular move with a lot of people because they figure they'll keep their grass cut and who cares what happens to the other folks. It's a very, it's really a question of people needing to pay more attention to the details of how their city government is operating, in my opinion.
Okay.
I think.
Okay, there are some more questions. I don't know whether you want to answer those separately. Should we just go ahead with these?
Sure.
And I want about 5 or 10 minutes to wrap up and tell about what's coming up. Okay. What about the suburban and Chicago wait lists? I'm assuming that the question is it different in Chicago versus the suburbs?
To wait for housing?
For vouchers. The wait list for vouchers. Adam had said it, only about a quarter of the people who apply get the vouchers.
So you apply for a voucher based on where you live now. So if you live in Chicago, you would be applying in Chicago for a voucher. If you got a voucher in Chicago, you could use it in a suburban community. You could take that voucher anywhere. So just the bigger problem is that there are so few vouchers, and the waiting lists are really long just about everywhere.
We occasionally get a few of the vouchers to use for a particular program, particularly for justice involved people. And I know it's always kind of heartbreaking because you figure if the vouchers are going one place, they're not going someplace else.
Okay. Can you clarify the difference between subsidized housing and affordable housing? And the pre-salon thing that I sent people, it goes into that a little bit, but anyhow, either Adam or Rebecca.
I mean, so my answer would be, going back to what Rebecca said at the beginning, like all housing is affordable to somebody. We have some categories of affordable housing. I think in what Beth sent around beforehand, it talked about capital A affordable housing.
Yeah.
So when we think about federal or state or local affordable housing programs, those are programs that are designed to serve people whose income is lower than a certain amount, and those people may be eligible for certain kinds of housing subsidies. But when we think about affordable housing, we have to think well beyond just subsidized affordable housing, because as we were saying, the vast majority of people who need affordable housing don't get subsidized housing. So the vast majority of people are living in housing that's provided through the private market. Some of that housing is still affordable based on its location, based on its quality. It may be well within people's means. But they're different categories.
Okay. In the new residential building in Morton Grove's rebuilt mall on Dempster, a group is trying to increase the percent of affordable housing. It's not a question, but it's some additional interest in affordable housing as once famous malls decide to go into residences. So
I think that's the future, is one of the aspects of the future, and we didn't talk, I feel bad because we should mention a few more positive things at the end of the show. You should always end with a positive. We are going to see a lot of dead retail when we come out of COVID. And I believe that is an enormous opportunity for expanding the pool of housing, and that it will not only, that there's a possibility to expand the pool of housing, but by expanding the housing, we may save some of the retail. Because one of the things that really helps retail is being housing closer to it. So,
that's cool.
My witless optimism about COVID bringing us to our senses, we will have gratitude and we also will have opportunity.
That's cool. Yeah.
I believe in that.
Merle Grouse asks, should police and fire persons live in the neighborhood they're attached to?
That was a really popular thing for a really long time in Chicago, was getting police officers to live in the neighborhood. I'm not sure how people feel about that right now. I certainly, there are so many things we need to do to have a better trained police force. I don't want to add to the barriers of recruiting police officers that are going to have to live someplace that they might not want to live. And so I would not be in favor of that. I'm more in favor of, and there's a whole nother program we'll do another time, of getting better trained and better supervised police in Chicago who are paid enough that they can then live wherever the hell they want to live. And hopefully we'll all be living in safer neighborhoods.
Okay.
That's
Thank you. We have a question. Are vouchers the same as Section 8? And then Robert Miller said vouchers is a new name for Section 8. So affordable housing generally refers to households with incomes below 60.
I thought Section 8 was still called Section 8. I'm a little confused, but I don't know the answer to that.
Okay.
Robert's right there. What used to be known as Section 8 is now referred to as a housing choice voucher.
Oh.
And then there are lots of different categories of eligibility. So there's some affordable housing that's produced for people who are earning like 80% of median income, some for people at 60% of median income or below, 50% of median income or below, 30% of median income or below. And all of these things
still say it's Section 8, but many of us normal people still call it Section 8.
Correct.
It walks like Section 8, it talks like Section 8, it pays the rent like Section 8, so yeah, fine.
Correct. But
Housing exposure, otherwise known as Section 8, but come on.
Right.
And is there anything we could use for a good close here? That's and segue to your upcoming hits.
Yeah.
Interfere with your ability
Oh,
to
I
promote
attached
programs.
the something, the AMI, so people can take a look at what the median incomes can be. And as I said, most of our issues revolve around supporting state bills, and we have to get really friendly with our alderman. Sounds like that's the closest thing.
The alderman is the key on this,
Okay.
I believe.
Okay. And paying attention as people, I've had wonderful curators helping me. Merle Gross and Joan Pomerantz and Robert Miller, some other people. So I'm going to be sending a whole bunch of resources. And there are tons of groups that are doing things, and somehow we have to figure out which ones to get connected with. My block, my hood, my city, I don't know if they have specific housing things, but I think there are other groups that do have that. Let me quickly give a plug for next week. We're having The Color Tax, which is a documentary film about how difficult it has been for Blacks to get mortgages. So what we've been talking about has been rental, because being able to afford a mortgage is a whole different thing, but all the discrimination about that. Our February meeting is going to be, we have a terrific speaker, Becky Foster, who's, and I had all this stuff down, who's going to be talking about difficulties for Native Americans and getting all sorts of services. She's supposed to be a terrific speaker. And there's a third one, but I will send it out to everyone that I will. Third program that I can't recall off the top of my head because paper isn't right in front of me. Wow, you both have been terrific. Yeah, the color tax is on February 3rd. The next spotlight is February 23rd or 22nd. And you have answered so many questions so honestly. So this is refreshing to really get the real story about everything. So, and what we can do is just be very aware and get involved with some of these other groups. Rebecca and Adam, do you want to add some closing notes?
I mean, I would just say that I do think that we're at a period where we're facing a lot of opportunities. And I hope as we think about how we all want to live together post-COVID, we'll think about housing in addition to the other things that we think about. It's just not worth it if you don't have a place to go home to.
Okay.
That is, I think many of us right now feel that we know our homes a little too well, but that's just for right now. And it should reinforce for all of us how important it is to have a home and how important it is to live in a city where other people have homes. So that would be my closing note.
Adam?
I would say amen to what Rebecca just said, and then just repeat something she said earlier, which is if there's anything that the last year has made clear, it's how incredibly interdependent we are, and that successful communities require lots and lots of people. And we have, as a city and a county and a state and a country, made it very difficult for lots of the people we need as neighbors to be our neighbors. And maybe the more we realize how much we all depend on one another, the more we'll welcome people into our communities and create more thriving ones.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. Adam and Rebecca, thank you so much. This has been terrific. So we're really expanding what we know about where we live. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Adam.
And I think we've answered all the questions, and I'll be sending out a summary to folks.
Thank you. Good
So,
night.
Thanks again.